Welcome to Ukrainian Catholic University Business School. My name is Alexander Akimenko. I am an academic director of the program on innovation and entrepreneurship at the business school, and we're constantly improving our master programs. And part of this improvement is inviting the best minds, people from our partners, universities, and different organizations. And today, we have an honor to have Professor Barry Katz, who has come from California, United States, and he actually works at California College of Arts, and he teaches design at California College of Arts, and also he spent more than actually 50 years teaching at Stanford University at Department of Mechanical Engineering, and also, he spent more than 20 years of his career at the company IDEO. Maybe you know them for creating such wonderful products as notebook computer or computer mouse or anything else, which is kind of started the smartphone revolution on the market. So join me in welcoming Professor Barry Katz. We are really honored to have you, and thank you for joining us. Thanks to you, was able to collect around $2,000 from this event to the charitable foundation of Oleh Vorobyov. So the floor is yours, and thank you for your visit.
I have to first thank Alexander Akimenko for the generous invitation, for the extraordinary hospitality that I have received in Ukraine. And I have to thank all of you for coming. I think everybody has something else to do. So it is a real honor for me. Alexander said that part of the program of the business school is to invite the best minds from around the world. Unfortunately, you'll have to put up with me until some of the best minds begin to show up. So let's just get started. I've been interested for the last several years in the phenomenon of innovation ecosystems, and that's what I'll talk about. My greatest concern is that I don't have anything to say that you don't already know. So we'll start off, and I hope that this turns into an interesting dialogue. Let me just start with a little bit of introduction. Are the lights okay, or should they be a little lower? I mean, what do you think? Is this good? I don't want you all in the dark, but I want you to be able to see. Let's leave it. Okay. As was said in the introduction, I wear multiple hats, one of which is I started teaching at Stanford University, which looks like a university. It's actually a $6.5 billion a year country club in Silicon Valley, sort of a research facility for Silicon Valley. And there I am a professor in the School of Engineering. About 20 years ago, I got in a fight with the dean of the engineering and I quit. And I went up to San Francisco, where I became a professor of design at California College of the Arts. And then the Stanford dean quit, so I went back to Stanford, but I was enjoying the art school so much, I decided to stay there as well. And on top of that, as Alexander mentioned, I've been affiliated for, until the beginning of the pandemic, really, with the largest and the oldest of the independent design consultancies, which is based in Silicon Valley, actually now in San Francisco. We're about, IDEO is about 750 people in 9 cities around the world. And I'll tell them that it's time to open an office in Lviv. All right. So the first thing I want to say is it's really great to be back in Ukraine. What, back in Ukraine? You've never been here before. It's actually not true. I left some of my DNA in Ukraine about 120 years ago. So that is a page of my grandfather's passport. And if you look closely, I discovered he was born in the region of Kherson. Sorry about the picture on the right, but it gives a certain poignancy to my own autobiography. And the story there is he left Ukraine somewhere around, not quite sure, maybe around 1912. Emigrated to Canada and borrowed enough money to buy a sewing machine, opened a small tailor shop, and when he had made enough money, he sent for his wife and the oldest of their three daughters, who was then, I think, 2 years old, and that is my mother. And she proceeded to have two sons, one of whom is in front of you right now. So literally, I am honored to be back in Ukraine. It's been a long time. Thank you. And the other reason I am honored to be back in Ukraine, I don't want to spend time talking about the war, but it's what, you know, the expression, the elephant in the room. I wrote back to my wife last night and who's terrified that Vladimir Putin is right now writing my name on a hypersonic missile. And what I said to her is, in Lviv, the war is everywhere and it is nowhere. So I almost don't feel a sense of a country at war in terms of, you know, there are no bombs going off. But it's a presence in everybody's mind and everybody's life, and I am aware of that as well. I'm sure you know some of this, but just in case this is extra information and inspiration for you, the whole world is on your side. So everywhere I look, I'm seeing expressions of deep support for Ukraine under the present circumstances, and I'm really proud in a very small way to be part of that. So here are some of the great monuments of the world. Celebrating is the wrong word. Marking the 1-year anniversary of the invasion. Even some of the great architectural monuments of Silicon Valley are expressing their support. So for instance, that is my house. And I didn't do this for this lecture, but if you wander around my small town of Palo Alto, which is sort of the headquarters of Silicon Valley, you'll see this everywhere. And the only thing I have to add to it is after a year, the flag didn't look blue and yellow anymore. There were no colors, so I just replaced it with a new flag. But you do see that everywhere, and it's really something that I would like Ukrainians to be always aware of, which is the world, with the exception of a few freedom-loving democracies such as North Korea and Cuba and Venezuela and a few other places, the world is on your side. And I am too. So that's Silicon Valley, and those are some of the outstanding tourist destinations. People love to visit the Golden Gate Bridge, and they love to surf, and they love to visit my house with the Ukrainian flag. But it turns out, somewhat to my surprise, that the real attraction to Silicon Valley is not my house, but the fact that we are the epicenter of an innovation ecosystem that, for good reasons or bad reasons, is the envy of the world. And I say for bad reasons with the following explanation. I have hosted, I don't know, maybe hundreds of visiting groups from around the world, and their question is always their first question is always something like, how do we build a Silicon Valley back home? How do we build a Silicon Valley in Bogota, Colombia? How do we build one in New Zealand? How do we build one in Western Ontario? And the simple answer to that is it's the wrong question. The question is never, how do we replicate something that worked in one place in another? It's what lessons can be learned, and some of those lessons are not so positive. And I'll try to share that a little bit with you. So this is what you've got. San Francisco is right at the top. It's not just a map with lots of corporate logos all over it. It's also kind of a historical map. So if you learn how to look at it, you can see the perhaps the the first of the tech companies, Hewlett-Packard in the 1950s, Intel in the 1970s. So the first stage is the microelectronics revolution, and you can just watch as one industry after another, not just companies, but one industry after another moves into this region. Most recently, it's, let's get this right, it's going to be game changers like OpenAI, which is down the street from my school in San Francisco. So why is all that, and what does it mean? Well, I don't think it's a boast to say that it is an extraordinary fact of history that this very narrow sliver of real estate has been responsible for some of the innovations that have transformed the way almost everybody in the world works, travels, communicates, plays, even thinks to a certain extent. So I don't know if you recognize the world's first video game, which is now, I don't know what, a $40 billion industry or something like that. That is the game Pong that was created by Atari in 1972. And it's totally stupid. You know, it's a simulated tennis game across a simulated table, and you put in your 25-cent piece and proceed to waste an enormous amount of time. But it's the start of an enormous global industry. The first personal computer. Okay, so if any of you have a personal computer, this is a joke, that is able to combine text, video, data on the same screen, that is a product of the innovation ecosystem, not just a bunch of smart engineers and scientists, but an ecosystem created there. The first social network. So the number of people that arrive in Menlo Park in order to be photographed in front of what used to be the Facebook thumb and is now the Meta thumb, unless you just lost your job at Meta, in which case it's that. They're firing 10,000 people a day. So this is a fact of history, and people, I think, quite reasonably want to know what went on in this region that contributed to this extraordinary wave of innovation. And it's not just a, whoops, did I just do that? And if so, Vlad, did I just break the machine? No, okay, thank you. It's not just historical either. And we're not clicking. I broke it. A bit of patience. Don't you hate it when somebody's talking about advanced technologies and you can't even get the... Okay. Can we advance the slide? I'm trying. I'm doing my best. Okay, yeah, there we go. The point that I wanted to make is this is not just looking backward at important things that happened 30 years ago or 40 years ago or 50 years ago. It's ongoing. As I mentioned, OpenAI is now transforming the landscape of artificial intelligence. It was, I don't know, somewhere around 2011, I think, that the number of IoT devices in the world approximately equaled the number of human beings on planet Earth. And now it's, you know, we're looking at something like 20 billion devices. I can't say that Silicon Valley invented the Internet of Things, but some of the most important laboratories and companies developing connected products have their origins in the region. Around 12, 15 years ago, Google announced that they were going to build a car that didn't need a driver. And our first reaction to that was, wait, you guys, you're a search engine. You don't know anything about car engines. And now practically every automobile company in the world is experimenting with one or another level of autonomous vehicles. So that's Google's first experimental prototype. It's called the Firefly, a charming little name, of an autonomous vehicle. There is there are no pedals, no gas, and no brake pedals in it because it's not necessary. So they put them on the streets in my neighborhood in Palo Alto and a few of the adjacent cities where Google is. And they made a conscious effort. I mean, I've talked to some of the people in the development process. They made a conscious effort to make it look cute and friendly. So they didn't want it to look like a Batmobile or a Formula One racing car, futuristic, because you get to a red light and you look over at the next car and there's nobody in it. This is scary. So they wanted to make it as friendly as possible. And I can't resist telling you just a short story. I have a photograph somewhere of taken by a guy who was standing on the balcony of his condominium as a Mountain View, that's the town, motorcycle policeman was trying to give a ticket to an autonomous Waymo vehicle. Why? Part of making it friendly and not frightening to other motorists in this very experimental moment was the engineers put a speed governor on the car so it can't go more than 28 miles an hour. What is that, about 35 kilometers an hour? So they move very slowly, and the car was holding up traffic. It was causing a traffic jam. So the cop pulled it over, and he's trying to figure out, do I give a ticket to the attendant who's sitting in the passenger side, although both sides are passenger? Do I give the ticket to the engineers who wrote the algorithms? Do I give the ticket to Sergey Brin and Larry Page, who are then running Google? So this poor policeman is going to go home and have a nervous breakdown because his world is changing underneath his feet and he doesn't know what to do. Can you even remember what the world looked like before we had mobile communications? So Steve Jobs gets on the stage and announces Apple is going to make a telephone, but it's also a web browser, and it's also a live interactive map operating off GPS, a completely new to the world product. So what you're looking at there is not simply an iPhone. You're also looking at, get this, the single most successful product in human history. And you can only say that about one thing, at least at one thing at a time. So not just products, but I know this sounds like a bit of a boast, but we'll get back to some of the other issues in a moment. Not just products, but entirely new business models have emerged out of this innovation ecosystem. Twitter, of course, Airbnb, now the largest hospitality company in the world, larger than the next two physical hotel chains put together, even though, as is often said, Airbnb does not own a single building. They don't even own the building in San Francisco that is their headquarters. So what kind of a hotel doesn't own a single room? And of course, Uber, which is causing such distress among the taxi drivers of Lviv, as we saw in the train station this morning. And I just want to make one point here. And no China bashing here. I spend a lot of time in China and with Chinese companies, and it especially intrigues me that so many Chinese organizations come to Silicon Valley to figure out how to take innovative ideas back there. So here are three Chinese equivalents to Twitter, Airbnb, and Uber. And I put the dates there for a good reason. Twitter was created in 2006. Airbnb 2 years later, Uber 2009. And note there is a 3-year time lag before something equivalent happens in China. Didi is as good, it's probably better actually in my experience than Uber. Weibo is used more widely than Twitter. But why is it that the idea came from a certain innovation ecosystem, even if the implementation was carried out more effectively, but 3 years later? And this comes up again and again and again. So it's a really interesting set of issues, and continues to fascinate me for all kinds of reasons. Here are two pieces of an explanation. It's obviously an extremely complicated story. But two factors contributing to what made Silicon Valley what it is, what it's become. One is simply geography. So what you're seeing in this slide is the evolution of personal computing from its earliest origins at SRI International, the former Stanford Research Institute. And that is, if any of you are computer science geeks, the laboratory of Douglas Engelbart, who essentially invented the online concept that we all use constantly. 10 years later, a crude laboratory science concept became a prototype in the corporate research lab of the Xerox Corporation. And 10 years after that, on account of a certain Stephen P. Jobs paying a visit to Xerox, seeing what they were doing there, and immediately asked, "This is extraordinary. What are you guys going to do with this concept of a desktop computer that anybody can use?" And the Xerox people said, "Well, the corporate guys in the East Coast don't see any future in personal computing," which is the single worst business decision in the history of business. So Jobs is out the door, back to his little startup that was named after a piece of fruit, and the rest is history. Apple is, of course, now the most valuable company in the world. And the point that I wanted to make here is this entire story, from laboratory science to consumer product, happens in the radius of a bicycle ride. And that is, and I make that point because that is not necessarily something that can be repeated or replicated everywhere in the world. And it's part of the reason why how do we build a Silicon Valley back home is not necessarily a great question. Second thing is, and I'll be making this point in a little bit more detail, there are cultural factors that are unique to a region and can't necessarily be exported from one place to another. That's what culture is. It's what makes a specific place unique. So it's a striking fact of history that some of the most important companies, if not all of the most important companies that are dominating the technology landscape of the Valley and of the world, they didn't start in lavishly equipped laboratories and gleaming skyscrapers with huge budgets. They started out in somebody's garage or in the dorm room of a couple of sophomores with nothing better to do. So there is David Packard and William Hewlett, as in Hewlett-Packard, beginning the electronics revolution with $738 that they borrowed from their PhD supervisor. And I always like to tell my students, there is a positive lesson to that and a negative lesson. The positive lesson is you can do it if you have the ambition. The negative lesson is don't ask me for $738. You're out of luck. But it's now a museum in Palo Alto, and that is literally the garage in which things started. There is a boring suburban home in the town of Los Altos. I made a mistake there. That should be Cupertino, never mind, where Steve and Steve, Jobs and Wozniak, away from the prying eyes of their parents, put together the Apple I, which doesn't look like a computer. It looks like a circuit board screwed onto a piece of plywood in their garage. Some years later, Sergey Brin was going out with a young woman whose mother happened to have extra space in her garage, which they rented to Sergey and his partner, Larry Page. And that's where they wrote the algorithms that led to Google. And the rest of that is history. So what is it about a garage that's so much better or so much more productive of innovative ideas than a gleaming research facility in a corporate lab and all of that? It's partly you can do whatever you want. You can make a mess. So I was just learning about the makerspace that is emerging not so far from here. And I'm delighted to hear that it's happening in an old disused industrial building where you can pretty much do whatever you need to do without anybody writing the rules except yourselves. So these are a couple of factors that you should just bear in mind that don't really translate or migrate very easily, geography and culture. Given that, one of the things that is really striking to me now is all around the world, we are seeing efforts to not copy Silicon Valley. That's not really my point at all, but to create deliberate, intentional ecosystems that will support innovation. It's actually an organization called, forgot the whole name of it, the International Association of Science Parks. So if you're a town or a city or a country or a region that is intent on building an innovation ecosystem, a science and technology-based ecosystem, you will contribute a certain amount of money to this trade organization, and it supports you in one way or another. So it's all around the world. It's in New Zealand and it's in South America. It's almost everywhere except a certain unnamed country, which seems to be curiously absent from the culture of innovation, although they're really good, I guess, at hypersonic missiles. But beyond that, it's pretty strikingly not a whole lot going on up there. You can connect the dots there if you want. So let's leave that out, and I'll give you a quick tour of some of the centers that are beginning to, well, some of them have been around for a long time, and others are just in the process of formation. If this gives you some ideas, great. That's really my point. It's not that there's something here that you should be trying to do in Ukraine, or for that matter, trying to avoid. It's about lessons learned. The oldest science and technology research park in the United States is in the state of North Carolina, and it is actually a public-private consortium called the Research Triangle Park. Triangle because it's connecting 3 university towns, the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Duke University, Durham, and Raleigh. So everything about it is in a triangle. It makes your head hurt. So even the buildings are triangular, and the logos are triangular, and the town is triangular, and it's too many points to me. It's the oldest of the innovation ecosystems in the US. It was created deliberately, and that's an important point I'll get back to in a moment. Created deliberately in 1959 as an engine of regional economic development. And it's been very, very successful. There are at present something like 200 companies, 46,000 employees, according to my last information. But it is focused, and this is important, it is focused around innovation in science and technology. That is its deliberate mandate, and that's what it does. And I'll be emphasizing in a few minutes why that particular focus is a real limitation. It's been very successful in what it does, but I don't want to go too far with it. The famous innovation ecosystem in Europe is probably Eindhoven, which was started by Philips as really a corporate research center for Philips, the electronics company, which covers everything from light bulbs to very, very high-tech diagnostic, medical equipment, and everything in between. Probably the single most important company in the Netherlands. So a high-tech campus, and that's their term for it. It's not just a slogan. The largest concentration of science and technology PhDs anywhere in the world is pretty extraordinary in that sense. But once again, it's focused on STEM, on science, technology, engineering, and spinning things off there. It was recently, I've forgotten in what year, but recently it was purchased by the American investment company Oaktree. So Eindhoven's high-tech campus is now privately owned, and it's clearly very, very successful in what it does, but it doesn't do everything, and it's a point worth emphasizing. In Asia, one of the most important is I never pronounce it very well, Hsinchu Science Park in Taiwan. soon, according to some of my Taiwanese sources, to be absorbed into the People's Republic of China. But that is a political issue that everybody is talking about and worrying about, but we'll see how it actually shakes down. The Hsinchu Science Park, created in 1980. So this has been around for 40 years. Something like 400 technology companies clustered together in a very, very specific region. And once again, with an almost exclusive focus on science and technology innovation. It's contributed enormously to Taiwan's gross national product and has been doing so for quite a number of decades. In China, the famous starting point is probably Zhongguancun, which is a region of Beijing. The Zhongguancun Park Center, it's not really a park, it's heavily, heavily urban, created in Beijing in 1988. It's sometimes known as Z Park. And it's been the source of companies doing work in fields ranging from biotechnology to consumer electronics. Many of the most valuable Chinese companies can trace their origins back to Zhongguancun, including Didi and Meituan, the shopping platform. It's sort of like our Amazon, Xiaomi, which is, depending on the time of day, the first, the second, or the third biggest phone company in the world, and so on and so forth. So we are seeing definite successes that can't really be disputed, but in a kind of a narrow range. Two final examples of innovation ecosystems, these two under development. So the several that I have profiled just very, very briefly are all pretty mature science, technology, innovation centers. And the rest of the world, including the global south, is looking at these models and asking itself, how can we get on board before we are left too far behind? So I have personally had some involvement in the emerging district of science and technology innovation in the city of Bogota, the capital of Colombia. So this is a privately funded venture, well, public-private, I should say, under the leadership of the what's it called? The Cámara de Comercio de Bogotá, the Chamber of Commerce of Bogota. The first stage of it is they just had an event several months ago in Bogota, as they're planning the first of the buildings, which has already been designed, and they are hoping to break ground on that in literally the next few weeks or few months, something like that. It's a city project, which is intended explicitly to stimulate the regional economy. So I don't think that anybody would say that that is characteristic of Z Park in Beijing, or for that matter, Silicon Valley in California. This is a regional initiative which is, once it's all built out with perhaps 50 buildings, once the project is realized, if it ever gets that far, but to contribute to business performance, quality of life, and they are trying to figure out how to make it an integrated ecosystem and not simply a science center. We'll see where that goes. And the last one, kind of an interesting, well, not kind of, it's a hugely interesting project in Vietnam. They are hoping to begin construction on this rather extraordinary set of structures that will put obviously an extremely developing country on the map. This is the Hoa Lac Innovation Center, which is part of the National Innovation Center project of the Communist Party of Vietnam. So I'm somewhat involved in that one as well. I am Zooming and corresponding with them on a pretty regular basis as they are looking for partners globally as well as internally within Vietnam. And I'm frankly pretty interested to see what will be the shape of an innovation center in a country that has historically been one of the poorest in the world and is now developing so quickly. Okay, now I want to make two points about what you've just seen. The first of them is each of them, from the old established Eindhoven centers to Research Triangle in North Carolina, right down to what you saw in Colombia in South America and Vietnam in Southeast Asia. All of them were consciously and deliberately planned. They were intentional, deliberate projects, and each of them is or will be centrally administered. I don't think this is either a good thing or a bad thing. It's simply a fact, but each of these factors distinguishes what's going on in these places from what I live in and what I'm familiar with in California's Silicon Valley, which was never planned. And it is certainly not a confined, focused, regionally governed thing. Silicon Valley happened almost by accident. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but not too much. But I'll get back to that in a few moments. There is a huge and a growing literature, an academic literature, a business literature on innovation ecosystems. And often I think that the authors must spend a lot of time looking at Greek architecture because they're always talking about the pillars of innovation and how we have to have the pillars of innovation put into place if we're going to achieve this. So that's kind of what it looks like. And there's the whole ecosystem temple happening. This is from a very important study done by some colleagues of mine at the business school at Stanford, together with the World Bank, E&Y, Ernst & Young, and you can't see it there, but there's also contribution from a very interesting nonprofit called Endeavor. What these studies tend to do, and I'm lumping together a lot of different approaches in a single slide, so you'll have to forgive me for generalizing a bit, but they tend to try to identify the factors or the components that will support a quote unquote innovation ecosystem. So you can see what they look like. You need accessible markets. You need smart people who have domain expertise in the biosciences or in electrical engineering or whatever it might be. You got to have money and you've got to have a bit of an infrastructure, cultural support, whatever that means. And most of the studies that I am familiar with go around the world and looking to see which of those pillars is in place, which of them needs to be developed, which of them is working well. Personally, I think it is the wrong approach. And I'll tell you why. What you are seeing here are, even though it's schematic, and I've said this before, a lot of you are business students, so that you know that business charts like this mean absolutely nothing, but they're useful teaching devices. The problem that I have with representations of this sort is each of these is an independent entity and not connected with the others. And what that means is it's not an ecosystem. The essence of an ecosystem, as I am experiencing it and thinking about it, is the interconnection among these assets. And I don't mean that to sound really abstract, but it means they have to be, money has to be talking to real estate has to be talking to infrastructure has to be talking to cultural forces, and on and on and on. And I'll show you what I mean by that in the Silicon Valley context. So here is one representation of the Silicon Valley ecosystem. And you'll notice that I did it in Ukrainian colors. Thank you. According to this model, this is a pretty simple one, and I don't particularly like it, although it is true. And according to this model, you've got a kind of interplay between technology and psychology, let's put it that way. In this model, the microprocessor revolution that we associate with companies like Intel and National Semiconductor and a few others back in the 70s began to change the landscape of technology and what was driving it. I have met a number of those pioneers. They are elderly now, but some of them are still alive. And they all, almost without exception, became fabulously wealthy, like you cannot believe. But I have yet to meet one of them who is able to convince me that they did it for the money. It was about inventing a new technology, and the passion, the drive, the motivation, sometimes the fear, excuse me, the fierce competition. It was motivated by bringing a new technology idea into existence. A decade later, and this is now the decade of Steve Jobs and that whole generation, the motivation was the microprocessor. It's really cool, computer on a chip, but on a chip doesn't really mean much to most people. It becomes interesting when you can put it in a box. So that is the short version of the personal computer revolution of the 80s. The motivation there, and if you can consider that the psychology component, start a company. It's not, I mean, Steve Jobs, just to give that almost cliche example, he's not an engineer. His technical competence was mocked by many people, continues to be. But he had this drive to start a company that would make this thing actually into a product. The next stage, the 1990s, this was the most depressing period in my academic career. That was the era of the growth of software. So again, an Apple computer running an Intel chip, great, and even greater when it's running all kinds of Microsoft software. And then it becomes a useful product for word processing or graphics or whatever else. I said it was depressing because I remember so well that generation of my students, and the motivation was make money. And I got so tired of hearing that. And then I was almost glad when in 2000, 2001, the dot-com economy crashed and they all left. And when they came back a decade later, what I began to hear from my students was third world development, sustainability, interestingly, K through 12 education as some of their motivations. And I got interested again. And that, of course, is the era of the internet and universal connectivity. So that is a fair representation of Silicon Valley. But again, I don't think that that explains an ecosystem, which is my main interest. And for that, I want to suggest, again, in Ukrainian colors, a really ugly slide. And I sort of apologize for that, but it's fair, it's sort of reasonable. So you remember when I showed you the Greek temple model of the pillars of innovation, and I worried that it doesn't convey the interaction among the elements. And I think that that is what really constitutes a vibrant organic ecosystem. So here's what I want you to be able to see here. Clearly, we have the technology companies, and that's the Intels and the Apples and the Facebooks and, the Metas and Google, Alphabet. I keep changing their damn names. So they are hard at work, but where are they getting their workforce? Where are they getting what the pillars of innovation model calls the human capital? They're getting them from a pair of major research universities, my own Stanford, plus Berkeley, plus a host of smaller and more specialized schools, including my art school, which is giving them designers and such. And they thank us, and that's why all of these arrows are going in multiple directions. They thank us by giving us lots of money. So as Alexander can tell you, you can barely go into a bathroom in Stanford without seeing a brass plaque saying this urinal was funded by Intel or somebody. So an interaction between human intelligence, if I can put it that way, and technology. We have in Silicon Valley something above 50% of all of the investment capital in the United States is invested in this small bit of real estate. And that's why real estate prices are so outrageous and traffic is so bad when times are good. So the venture capitalists are funding new technology startups. They are often the same people, interestingly enough. Strong connection between the VCs and universities. A third factor, won't go into lots of detail about what's going on here. I think you get the idea. A third factor is we've developed actually a rather specialized field of corporate law, which has specialized in two things. One is intellectual property law. So you don't have much incentive to put a new idea into the market unless you are assured that it will not be stolen by your competitors in China. Or in the United States for that matter. Oh, so here's a nice little story. You can compare the Apple iPhone and the Samsung Galaxy. Those two companies spent $100 million suing each other in court over intellectual property violations, even though there's a ton of Apple technology in the Samsung phone and a ton of Samsung technology in the Apple phone. But it's a big deal. So corporate IP law, intellectual property, is a big deal. You cannot go through one of the local law schools and learn how to do divorces and torts and, you know, renters agreements, and then sit down and work through some of the incredibly complex issues in biotechnology, artificial intelligence, or other emerging fields. So I know plenty of lawyers in the region who have PhDs in the technical disciplines. In one case, I know a guy who has a PhD in applied physics. He was working for IBM, and IBM picked him up and put him in Stanford Law School for 3 years at the company's expense, saying, "You are more valuable to us as a lawyer than as a physicist." So that kind of interconnection. The other form of law that is not any longer unique to the region, but was, I think, pioneered there, is I'd call it venture law. That's my own term, and I don't know if anybody else is using it, but it's essentially like venture capital, where law firms will, in effect, trade legal services. They will provide legal services almost for free in setting up a legal corporation in return for return on their investment over the long term. And that's a very unusual, if not unique, setup. Okay, so I hope that's clear, and you can kind of at least intuitively get a sense of that spaghetti of arrows, everything pointing in multiple directions. There's one other feature in it, which you're noticing, I hope, and that is design. The design industry in Silicon Valley is of critical importance. That's actually what I have specialized in my own work. And it often surprises me that it has been so neglected in the studies of innovation ecosystems for reasons that I am about to explain, and I'll try to do so kind of briefly. And I'll do it by introducing you to somebody whose name you probably know. Are you familiar with Moore's Law? Everybody knows about that. So there's Gordon Moore and the sketch that he made for his famous article of 1965, cramming more components onto integrated circuits. And it will lead to Moore's Law, which initially said that the number of transistors on a chip will approximately double every 18 months. And shockingly, I mean, the 12 months, 24 months, those numbers have been adjusted over time, but almost shockingly, that has remained true up to the present day. So here's Moore's Law as he stated it. Integrated circuits will lead to such wonders as home computers, automatic controls for automobiles, and personal portable communications equipment. Of course, none of this stuff existed when he formulated Moore's Law in a very casual way back in the 60s, but all of it came true. So most of you are familiar with that, at least intuitively, but you may not be familiar with Moore's other law. And this is it. Stay away from the consumer market. And the reason for that is they had a bad experience at Intel in 1974 when Gordon Moore and his colleagues, Robert Noyce, co-director of Intel, said, we're so smart and our engineers are so good. We've miniaturized everything. What's the next thing that we can miniaturize? Ah, a wristwatch. So they produced the Microma wristwatch. And It was purchased by every engineer at Intel and nobody else. So Gordon Moore, let's see if I can do that right. Yeah, he wore his Microma watch. I am told that he wears it to this day. I believe he's 95 years old and still living in San Francisco. And he is wearing that as a reminder, stay the hell away from the consumer market. Why? Because we engineers, we understand microcircuitry. We don't understand crap about human behavior. Electrons behave in a way that is predictable, controllable, rational. We like that. Human beings are completely lunatic. We don't like that. We don't know how to deal with it. So for literally decades, most of the tech companies in Silicon Valley, the only exception being Atari, the game company, but almost every other tech company learned Moore's second law. He'd never called it that. That's my own formulation of it. But they learned Moore's law, second law, and they stayed away from thinking about how to move their radical technologies into the domain of consumer products. Why is that so important? Pretty simple. Have any of you ever bought a printed circuit board? Okay, as I thought. Any of you ever buy a laptop computer? Okay, everybody in the room? Yes. Anybody ever buy an internal combustion engine? No, no teenagers in the room, but I bet a few of you have bought a car. I think so. Yeah. Okay. Any of you ever download by JavaScript? Actually, some of you probably have. Okay, thanks. Okay, but probably the vast majority of you have done something equivalent to download Tinder and swipe left and swipe right, and then do whatever you need to do. The difference between a technology and a product is design, to put it very, very simply. And it is when we enter the consumer market that the big driver of economic change happens. There is a pretty good reason why Apple is the most valuable company in the world, and it's not because of basic research. Let's just put it that way. Let me illustrate it kind of vividly this way. This is, again, Moore's law in operation, showing the radical decline in the cost of a transistor. A transistor at the time of Moore's first law probably cost, estimates vary, $12 to $20. And progressively, this is, of course, a logarithmic curve, progressively, they disappear to the point where they are essentially free. Note the green circle, and that's what's going on there. Sometime around 1984, computing technology jumps, well, I'll put it differently. Sometime around 1984, the cost of computing has plummeted so much, and the power of computing has become so strong that it becomes possible for the computer to jump over the green dotted line and enter the consumer market, in which you are no longer selling a few hundred to banks or airlines or insurance companies, or maybe a few thousand to government offices, but tens and hundreds of millions. And that is going to drive an economy like nothing that we've seen. So that is one way of starting to think about the importance of design and the design industry, which is what we've been talking about in our course at UCU this week. Here's a little bit of why that happens and why it is so important. Just 3 quick object lessons for you to begin to wrap things up. Why design is so important. The first of them is, for most people, the differences in the technological core of a product is meaningless. So what is the difference between a Samsung Galaxy, your Huawei phone, my Apple iPhone, or an Oppo phone? Engineers will tell you, and they'll be very proud of the differences, but for most human beings, megapixels and gigabytes and things like that, they're just numbers. So what matters, and what people will say if you ask, why did you buy this one rather than that one? It has something to do with the experience of using the product. And design is essentially about creating experience. Second thing is it's about mobility. So as products become smaller and cheaper and also closer to the human body, so you're carrying them, you're wearing them, and pretty soon you will be injecting them, your tolerance for a bad experience disappears. So the best example that I like to give is email. So I'm old enough to remember when email was introduced. And in the first years, it was wonderful and it was terrible. It was terrible because it made this screeching noise when you dialed it up on a modem. It crashed all the time. You had to memorize commands. But we put up with it for two reasons. First, it was new and totally cool because I could communicate with my friends anytime I wanted to rather than when they happened to be awake. And secondly, how often did we use email? Twice a day. I looked at my email when I woke up in the morning. I looked at it again when I went to bed at night. So how often do you look at email or whatever is your social media equivalent? According to Google, Americans are checking their email every 5.6 minutes. So that's whatever it is, 250 times a day or something like that. And when an experience or an activity is so closely tied to your physical body and so closely integrated into the rhythms of your day, of the pattern of your day, you won't put up with a bad experience. And again, design delivers experience. So there is computing moving from the back room of a huge insurance company to the desktop of every white-collar worker, the laptop of Gen X. One of my Chinese students gave me that wonderful slide from the Beijing metro of these two young lovers embracing each other. It's not clear who they're in love with, though, down to Gen Z. And you probably can't make out that last slide, so I blew it up a little bit. This is a project that we did at IDEO in which our clients were an interesting pair. So we've done lots of work for Google and lots of work for Levi's, but we have never done work in which the two clients together engaged us to create a wearable denim jacket with conductive fiber in it. So it's essentially a wearable computer for bicycle messengers. So at this point, you can understand that the bicycle messenger does not want to sit down at a keyboard and type out a bunch of commands. It's got to be as closely integrated into the character of life as you can get. Okay, so where does this leave us? Let's, actually, excuse me, there was one more point I wanted to make. The comparability of technology, the integration of products into our lives, two explanations for the importance of design as we move from technology to product. A third is, think about this in your own lives. We don't really buy products anymore, we buy systems. We buy things that are connected to other things. So I'm a runner, as it happens. And in the old days, I used to buy a pair of shoes, put them on and go out for a run, and a pair of shorts. Today, I will buy a pair of shoes with a sensor in the heel that uses Bluetooth technology to connect to my phone, my music player, and my tablet, which records my performance and transmits it to my entire social network, even though they don't care. So the task of making all of these components of a system work together, interoperable, that's a task of engineering. But the job of giving us a common experience across elements of a platform, that is a task of design. And there are many, many examples that we could give of exactly that. So here's what happened. McKinsey, I forgot what year that was, probably about 10 years ago, did a famous study. Designers have always been complaining, nobody likes us, nobody understands us, nobody appreciates that we're not just cute, we really do add value to companies. So McKinsey decided to test that proposition, looking at several hundred companies and several thousand design decisions and several million examples over the course of something like 5 years. And they concluded that design-driven companies, according to their definitions, added, I forgot the number, something like 32% more profitable than companies that don't take design seriously. And that in turn has led to this remarkable movement, which I, for better or worse, am part of people asking, companies asking, so what is it that designers actually do? How do they work? And even how do designers think? And so we find ourselves with this emerging movement of design thinking. So that is a kind of brief explanation of how design came to play such an important role in the innovation ecosystem and why that is such a different phenomenon than simply a science and technology center on the outskirts of some city. A few final points. Along with the appreciation from the business world of design, designers have taken on a set of new responsibilities themselves. So the interesting thing that's going on is, whereas designers used to busy themselves smoothing fonts on a screen or the radius of my MacBook or whatever it is, designers themselves have begun to expand their horizons and move into domains of activity that nobody would have ever thought were part of design. Sometimes getting in way over their heads, by the way, and there are plenty of embarrassments. This is Horst Rittel, R-I-T-T, oh, you've got it there, a German mathematician and designer who divided his time between the city of Ulm in Germany and Berkeley in California, and formulated this wonderful idea. Now that these relatively easy problems have been dealt with, what's a relatively easy problem? It's designing a water bottle or a piece of furniture. And people who do that don't think it's easy, but it is. In the sense that we know how to do it. We have methodologies, we have materials. We've got that down. It's time for us to move on to more complex problems. So I know designers today who are working on pediatric obesity as a design problem. American children are fat. And the assumption when you take your kid to first medical checkup at the age of 3 or 4 or 5 is that the kid will be overweight. Dealing with that as a design problem, dealing with teen pregnancy in East Africa as a design problem, dealing with urban violence in the United States as a design problem, dealing with the post-war reconstruction of Ukraine as a design problem. This is getting interesting. I said I was going to conclude, and now I really will. Oh, I did that in Ukrainian also, okay? Just because it's so important. Thank you, Google. I hope the translation is close, but it's an important concept. I will conclude, and I promise to, and now I will, with just 3 final examples, because people like case studies. So case study number 1, you might have heard of this company called, named after a piece of fruit. And there's the big guy, my former neighbor, Steve Jobs, who lived about a mile away from my house. But what I like to say is it's a very long mile. So you saw my house and you can imagine his house. Okay. And there's his remark in which he is helping us to understand that design is much different than what most people think of. It's not simply how it looks. It's everything about the experience of a product. So that is, of course, the Apple ecosystem. And what really distinguishes this company and has made them so phenomenally successful is the closed system, the manner in which every part of the Apple family of hardware and software products works together more or less seamlessly. And I don't want to be too idealistic there. I've never bought an Apple product that doesn't have some problems with it, but they've still, I think most people would say, set the bar for that. It's probably no accident. This is Apple's headquarters, known as the spaceship. And it's a perfect Apple product. Let's face it. It is beautiful. It is hideously expensive. It's the most expensive office building in the world. Initial price tag, $5 billion, probably twice that once we get all the change orders in. And it's also completely closed off to the outside world. So that's Apple in its own way. And I just had to make a little footnote there. I'm sorry for that nasty slide of Kharkiv, but Norman Foster on the left is the architect of the Apple campus in Cupertino, California, and he has also been partnering lately. This is in some ways much more inspiring to me, with the mayor of Kharkiv to develop a master plan pro bono with the engineering firm Arup to rebuild the city of Kharkiv. But that is not something in which I have any particular expertise. Google is my second example of three. Google is now Alphabet. So here's the story there that explains, again, the rising importance of design. Google was born in the middle 1990s. The company grew so fast. There may be a few of you who remember what it felt like to try to find your way around this new World Wide Web thing. And Google provided the answer, a search engine. And the company grew so fast that its various divisions went off in completely different directions. So if you were working on search, you were in a bunch of buildings over there and renting new ones all over the place. If you were working on Gmail a few years later, you had a different set of directors. If you were working on Maps, something else. And people were complaining, Google's customers were complaining that it felt to them that as they moved from one application to another, it wasn't moving from one app to another, it was moving from one company to another. It felt completely discontinuous. So there was a very important moment in which Larry Page, who was then CEO, gathered together the design leads of each of the divisions and announced what he called Project Kennedy. They've got this Kennedy obsession. And the goal of it was to integrate all of Google's hardware and software products under a common design language. So lots of companies have had design language, and it's usually making the fonts all consistent with one another. Did I just do that? I did. Okay, sorry. So you already saw my punchline. Okay, I'll move fast now. So when Google does something now, Alphabet, it's a pretty big deal. So they don't take things like that lightly. Second, and that's Google's new emerging headquarters. They don't want me to call it a headquarters, but the campus, a set of buildings that are simply extraordinary and represent, in my own view, a new architecture of the information technology industries. More on that in my next lecture someday. Third example is Tesla. Still, I believe, the most valuable automobile company in the world, but Elon Musk is such a nutcase, we don't know how long that will last. But for the moment, here's a good story. So there's, what's his name on, who is so rich he can't even afford a chair, sitting on the desk of his lead designer, whose name is Franz von Holzhausen. He's an American, despite his very Germanic name. And I asked Franz once in conversation to tell me about his own career. He used to be the lead automotive designer at Chrysler and then Mazda. So he actually designed my car, which is a little Miata, which I really love. It's a great car. But I asked him, what is different about working for Mazda and working for Tesla? And very interesting answer. So there's the proof. He designed both of those cars. And if you can tell them apart, good for you. What he said to me is, at Mazda and throughout the automotive industry generally, the designer is a link in a chain. Connects, here's R&D, and they throw a new idea over the wall to engineering. Engineering builds it, throws it over the wall to the next silo to design. They put it in a sexy shell, and they throw it over the wall to marketing. And marketing figures out how to sell it to you. Obviously, that's an exaggeration, but the general norm. And what he said is, at Tesla, we're not a link in a chain. And recognize a link is important, obviously. If one link breaks, you've got no chain. But it's fundamentally different at what I think is still the most innovative, well, let's put it this way, the company that has made the most important innovation in the automotive industry in 100 years. What's different there is the design function is not part of a sequence, but as he described it, more a hub of a wheel. It took me about an hour to figure out how to do that, by the way, so please respect that. From a link in a chain to the hub of a wheel. So he is, as a designer, and again, this guy went to the Art Center College of Design in Los Angeles and studied automotive design and, you know, drew renderings of sexy Batmobiles. But he finds himself sitting at the same table as the head of aeronautical engineering at Tesla, who is worrying about airflow over the body, the head of mechanical engineering, who's worrying about the drivetrain, electrical engineering, that display on the panel, and so on and so forth. And his job is to coordinate all of those functions. That doesn't sound like anything that designers learned in school a generation ago, but that is an emerging transformation that explains why design has become so important. And there's since I'm showing all the other buildings, there's the Tesla manufacturing plant in Fremont, California, across the San Francisco Bay from where I live. And if you look really closely, you can see a human being there. And I don't know what he's doing, but I hope he's having a good time. Okay, and now let's draw some final conclusions from this story. So there is an ecosystem. And it is the nature of an ecosystem. I mean, there's even a definition of it that biologists like to use. And the nature of an ecosystem is every component depends on every other component for its survival. And this looks to me totally different from the Greek temple with its 8 pillars of innovation and those 8 separate components that, as they are represented in so much of the research, have nothing no interaction with each other, which makes no sense to me whatsoever. I find it so surprising. So here are the lessons that I would learn, that I would suggest that I have learned from looking at the Silicon Valley ecosystem in comparison with some of the science and technology innovation centers, some of them fabulously successful in other parts of the world. But I think a science and technology center is not necessarily an ecosystem. So here are a few lessons that I will share with you. Actually, let's do it this way. It'll be quicker. First, what defines an ecosystem, it's not simply your assets, your lawyers and your engineers and your academics and your money guys, but the organic interconnection and interdependence of those assets. And this is a lesson that I hope is relevant to Ukraine as you begin to think about how you're going to handle what I hope is a flood of money that comes into the country in the aftermath of the war. The organic interpenetration and interdependence of assets. My second lesson is building bridges is really important. So we do things like we're doing a workshop right now at UCU, and we've got people coming from a whole bunch of different industries, different disciplinary backgrounds, and we're doing a lot of exercises. Some of them might look a little bit silly. What they are doing in the 4 days of our workshop, they're building trust. They're building lines of communication among people who might not otherwise be talking to each other. And that is, I cannot overstate the importance of that. Building bridges, but also removing obstacles, which can often be much more important. And I wouldn't presume to tell you what the obstacles in the Ukrainian ecosystem are. You know that, I don't, but you all know that they exist. Third lesson is don't confuse architecture with entrepreneurship. So this is in Shenzhen in China. It's the Shenzhen Genzone Technology Innovation Center as planned. And apart from being possibly the ugliest building that I have ever seen in my life, it reminds me that bricks and mortar or steel and glass are ultimately less important in the coming era than bits, bytes, and networks. So it worries me very much when I see my friends in Colombia investing so heavily in buildings. Yeah, you need a place to physical environments, but don't confuse that with an ecosystem. And especially since the importance of physical space is now being redefined in such a radical way. Fourth, this is a really important one, honor your culture. And in every conversation I've had in the last 4 days, I'm getting these extraordinary messages of pride in Ukrainian culture. And I don't think that's just because of the war. Honor your culture. It is the one thing that every region possesses that nobody else has. I mean, every region has its culture, but they're all different and they are unique. So what have we got here? It looks like medieval Oxford and Florence. This is the campus of Huawei in Dongguan, China. And I can't believe that they spent, what was it like? I have the number here because I couldn't believe it. My computer doesn't believe it either. Wait a second. Yeah, $1.5 billion. This is one campus, and each of these is a separate component of the campus, modeled on, each one modeled on one of 12 different European cities. And, you know, whatever you might think of China and the rule of the Chinese Communist Party, they've got a really long history, and it's a really inspiring history, and there is a deep culture. Why on earth would one of the leading high-tech companies of China build a campus that is so painfully, comically derivative of somebody else's culture? So the lesson for me there is build on who you are and what you've got. And the final one is, I don't know if this is good news or bad news. All of the ecosystems or the technology systems that I described I made this point, they were planned and they are centrally directed. Good luck with that. There are limits to planning. So I get to go back to my DNA in the region around Kherson. So I'll teach you a little bit of Yiddish. Is that okay? Der Mensch tracht und Gott lacht. Man plans and God laughs. And okay, somebody's got to deal with that before I lose my life. Judina plania avo smitia. Am I close? Okay. There are limits to how far you can plan. I'm always reminded of the Emperor Frederick the Great. He was asked what explains his great record of military victories, and he explained, you control all of the logistics, you train your troops, you plan the supply lines and everything else, and leave the rest to His Majesty chance. So that's the story of the black swan. You probably all know of Nicholas Taleb's theory of black swans, the unpredictable event that nobody could imagine beforehand, that has massive consequences, and that looks obvious in retrospect. And I don't know, I think that the immediate post-war future of Ukraine is going to be so full of black swans that you should be thinking about how to turn that to your absolute advantage. And with that, I would like to thank you all very much for your attention. And I'm not quite done. Wait a minute. I need that slide again. Vlad, where are you? That one? No, next one. Which one? Could somebody advance that one for me? That one.
Barry, thank you for this wonderful, wonderful lecture, and let's turn it into a conversation. So we're ready to take several questions from the audience. My colleagues will help you with the microphone. So please, if you have any question, raise your hand. And
I'm sure that Alexander will be happy to answer them. I hope it all made sense. I mean, I covered a lot of territory.
I will give you mine.
Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your lecture. I've noticed that all innovation centers you talked about, they have something in common. They are offline, let's say. Mm-hmm. We had COVID, now we had war.
Yeah.
Do you still think that in a modern time, their location is equally important? Or maybe we should move to something like networks?
Yeah.
Or like computers move to the cloud, we also need to build
Yeah.
in virtual innovation.
Yeah, yeah, I think absolutely correct in that. I don't think the importance of physical space will disappear, but it is changing. And I think that is an absolute fact. And that is personally why I worry a little bit about the enormous investments in real estate and architecture. I mean, I happen to love architecture. It's my hobby. So I love to see great buildings, but I worry about committing yourself to a particular piece of real estate. And it's partly because I think you all know this. We are in an increasingly distributed world. That was already happening before the pandemic. And with the pandemic, I mean, here's just one short story to answer your question. Every few weeks, Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, sends out an email to all of Apple employees in the San Francisco area. Good news, everybody, we're moving back into the campus, that round spaceship. And when I last looked, 5,300 Apple employees wrote back and said, oh, no, we're not. We're very happy working at home, moving to Idaho and living on, my grandparents' ranch, getting to know our husbands and our wives and our children and our dogs, not spending 3 hours commuting back and forth every day in the car. I mean, very human considerations, not to mention the fact that, a fair amount of the coding for many of the Silicon Valley startups is being done in Ukraine by a couple of undergraduates in, somebody's apartment building. So I think the answer is something happens when you are in a face-to-face environment, but it's no longer what it was a generation ago, and it will continue to evolve in the future. I think that's absolutely predictable.
Question here.
Professor Katz, thank you very much for inspiring lecture. And if I may, I wanted to ask you to dig deeper into military roots of Silicon Valley and designing proper ecosystems.
Yeah.
The reason I'm asking that, I believe at least a quarter of people in this room are somehow involved in sourcing, delivering, logistics, designing different military related technologies. That's our life. Like Ukraine has a crowd-funded DoD. And in the Valley, you had the centralized funding, which brought the Fairchild Semiconductors and other future electronic giants. So my question would be how you take the bunch of guys who are creating one of the most impressive and deadly military innovations we at the moment when we need them, in the garages, auto body shops for auto designs and other places, who are great engineers who do not have access to the department, to our Ministry of Defense money, and help them scale. How we can create the great military industrial complex out of the bunch of guys using trenches, garages, homes to design the next generation of defense technology. Thank you.
Very important question. My first answer to that is be careful what you wish for. If I had the answer of how to do that, I would tell you, but I mean, there will be a victory. And it's so interesting to me in all of my Zooms with Alexander over the last year, he never spoke about post-war. He only spoke about post-victory. You're aware of that? So I share the confidence in that. I would worry about an emerging economy that is too heavily dependent on one sector, whether it be military or biotech or video games for that matter. There's a long history of vulnerability of regions that have become too focused on one area, not to say one technology. Having said that, the military roots of Silicon Valley, they're a matter of record, and almost nobody likes to talk about it, which is sheer hypocrisy in my view. So what was the fastest growing company in Silicon Valley, even before it was named Silicon Valley? That term happened in 1974 by a journalist who was also an alcoholic. It was Lockheed, far and away the fastest growing company and the driver of so much of what happened. Second thing is, you may be familiar with the government agency DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. The point that I would make there, so DARPA was created in the era immediately following Sputnik. So here's the United States. We emerged from World War II triumphant, the leader of the world, certainly the free world. And here are these godless atheists in the USSR beating us into space. How did that happen? So out of that, DARPA was created to kickstart technology education and technology development in the US. And a lot of the DARPA programs, I mean, they funded Douglas Engelbart's laboratory that developed the first online system. So the computer mouse happened there in the 1960s, linked commands, interaction with computers, that all happened with DARPA funding. The reason that it annoys me that many people in Silicon Valley pretend to dislike the military industry is they're up to their necks in it, whether they know it or not. And I think this is your point. So a lot of military funding went into projects with military applications, but then spilled over into the civilian economy. The best example, have you heard of this thing called the internet? Okay, GPS, those were all DARPA-funded projects which spilled over to the civilian economy. So I'm not sure how I would answer the question about scaling what is such a big part of the tech environment of the Ukraine. But I would say, I mean, if anybody asked me my opinion, which you just did, and my opinions are free and you get what you pay for, so be clear about that, it would be watch for opportunities to move beyond weapon systems, defense systems, and even exporting technical expertise to military establishments elsewhere. Watch for opportunities for spillover into, do you know have you heard of Lewis Mumford? Is that a name that is known to people? A great American historian. He used to talk about technologies of death and technologies of life. So I would be looking for opportunities to spill over from military into technologies of life. Yeah. So
thank you very much. We have a question here.
Thank you for the question, though.
Thank you for such a interesting, insightful talk, Mr. Katz. My question is, from what I understand, most of the, or almost all of the hubs, technology hubs, like in the Silicon Valley, and most of the startups are located not more than 40 minutes drive from the venture capital companies. Yeah. So I don't know if you know this, but Ukraine have like many components that you present, but we surely don't have the financial one.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, have you seen such I would say successful hubs that don't have this financial components, or how to overcome this challenge in your experience? And if you know such cases, please share. Thank you.
That's a tough question, and I'm not sure that I have a very satisfactory answer for you. What you said at the beginning of your question is absolutely true. In my region, so we're talking Silicon Valley, I stop in and have coffee with my friends at Foundation Capital, who have just funded a designer-led startup. And we meet for lunch afterwards, and then we walk over to somebody's house and watch Netflix. And there is this immediate proximity of money and academia and startup talent. Part of the story that I wanted to tell is, again, there are certain things that are really difficult to export from one region to another, and that physical proximity, like culture, those are the two biggest obstacles. So I would say in the Ukrainian case, all I can do is kind of speculate that many of the money resources will be outside of Ukraine, at least in the foreseeable future. So being able to tap into sources of investment capital elsewhere are probably going to be critical in Ukraine's near future. I am predicting, and I'm, okay, I'll interrupt myself, which you notice I love to do. You know, the Danish physicist Niels Bohr, he used to say, prediction is very difficult, especially when it's about the future. You could see that coming, right? Okay, so I will nonetheless hazard the prediction that what you're going to see in the immediate post-war or post-victory period is a flood of money into Ukraine. Some of it good, some of it, you know, looking to sell you something. We've got services to help rebuild Kharkiv, and you know, all you need to do is pay us for it. But I am predicting that there will be a big flood of investment money and investment opportunity. Figuring out how to handle that in a way that avoids the obvious pitfalls of waste and corruption and everything else. I would like to think of that as the design challenge of the next generation. So that's the best answer that I can give you. It's a really good question and a really tough one.
Thank you very much. Next question, please.
Hi, thank you for the lecture.
Everybody's thanking me. Thank you for inviting me.
It's becoming a tradition, so please do bear because it was quite good. So my question is about the design policy question, the policy design rather. So Ukraine, and not only, many places do want to have innovation ecosystem, and therefore many are throwing good money after the bad one, building these flashy buildings, setting up institutions, etc. So Ukraine does want indeed also to have this money, which are phantom at the moment, but we're all chasing them, hoping, praying for them, that they will kickstart the innovation ecosystems in Ukraine too. So there's Dan Bresnes, who wrote this book about the innovation in real places, and he put this idea that I actually liked a lot, and I want to hear your question, that to design these policies for innovation ecosystem, you rather need to focus on agents of innovation, on people, on the entrepreneurs, on the companies, or leaders from university, from others. So what's your kind of take on that idea of Dan? And also maybe you have other suggestions how Ukraine can design policies to kickstart innovation ecosystems, for instance, in Lviv or in Kharkiv. Thank you.
Another excellent question. It's undeniable that there are individual human beings who drove much of the accomplishments of Silicon Valley. And we can name them, and they're sort of heroes. You heard me say Steve Jobs a bunch of times. Okay. Some of the technology entrepreneurs of the preceding generation, and then the social network entrepreneurs, the Zuckerbergs, we know all of their names. So here's what you might wish to think about. They all either emerged out of this ecosystem, and that's the case of Steve Jobs, or they migrated to it, and that would be the case of Mark Zuckerberg, just to give two celebrity examples. In other words, it was not simply a case of a couple of gifted individuals, guys, but of, in a sense, having a seed that could be planted in fertile ground. So I will never want to discount the importance of individual human drivers with the intelligence and the passion and sometimes the ruthless competitive spirit. And sometimes they're real assholes, to be perfectly honest. But there are such people everywhere, and they don't necessarily do anything with their gifts. So there is some kind of a combination that I think you have to strive for, of creating the environment in which that kind of talent will flourish. And I think the best of the companies and the best of the regions that I have seen have managed to achieve that. That's my short answer to what is potentially a very long and exciting conversation.
Thank you very much, dear friends. Before giving you the opportunity to ask a couple more questions, I would lead your attention into the QR code, which you are seeing on the screen here. And we would be grateful if you help us to endow one stipend for the student at the future student at the business school, and commemorate the memory of Oleh Vorobyov. So the next question.
I am very proud to be contributing my hour of chat to the scholarship.
I have a fun question. Do you think there was any connection between mass usage of psychedelics in 60s and the following innovations coming from the same talent?
In one word, okay, there's a child present, so yes. Yeah. So I'm going to go way back to the very early years before Silicon Valley was a concept. One of the earliest technology companies is one, I don't know if anybody has even heard of Ampex. They invented magnetic recording. So before Ampex, all sound recording was on a wax disc, and after Ampex, it was on magnetic tape. And then they moved into video recording and then data recording. And for a while, it was Hewlett-Packard and Ampex were the two technology companies of the region. And between them, they employed about 100% of all of the designers, 3 people in the region. So employee number 0 at Ampex was a very brilliant electrical engineer named Myron Stolaroff, Stolaroff, in case you don't believe me. And he was in the habit of taking 5 or 6 of his senior engineers and packing them into his station wagon and driving them out to his summer home in the Sierra Mountains and filling them full of LSD on a pretty regular weekend basis. And several of them, you know, they're probably still out there hallucinating. So the answer to that is it's actually yes, and we can document that. The kind of serious answer is there are many parts of the world in which you have a counterculture, which is full of drugs and crazy haircuts and music and such, and then a tech culture in which people are walking around and they're very clean cut and they're talking algorithms and things like that. Silicon Valley has been somewhat unique in those are often the same people. So I know people who have been senior software managers at companies that you've heard of, and then they'll drop out for 6 weeks and follow the Grateful Dead around on their European tours and things like that. So, and there is a little bit of literature on this, some of which is very enjoyable. I can refer you to it. But, you know, quite honestly, a lot of people have wished to say, in order to move things into a different zone, a different domain, and I'm talking about in technology, you need a kick from the outside. And sometimes that kick has come from drugs. That is a historical fact.
And not a medical recommendation.
No.
So
unless you want to.
Yeah. Any other questions, comments? So I think we have finished, dear Barry. I thank you for this amazing 1.5 hour, or maybe even 2. And dear friend, thank you for joining us for this brilliant event. And it was a pleasure to have you here and all of you here. So, I think that you will stay with us for as long as we exist. Come to UCU Business School to study, send your employees to study here. So we're waiting for you. Thank you for your attention and for this evening.
And thank you for your question.